Welcome. So glad you guys could be here today. For our students that know me, I'm going to introduce myself to the rest that don't. I'm the Worldview Director for Prestonwood Christian Academy. My name is Dan Panetti, and I'm so pleased to welcome not only our students who are used to this, but students from other schools and obviously some adults from around the area. I want to thank especially Prestonwood Baptist Church for hosting us and letting us come into the sanctuary today, the worship center. What a great facility we have to host a debate, and as well as our school, Prestonwood Christian Academy, for putting this together, and all those who worked behind the scenes to make this a reality. There's a lot of work that went on. I would know because all the people who were working kept telling me what to do, and when I didn't do it, they did it for me, so I appreciate that tremendously. But what a great day we have for you. We also have 7 Star Academy is actually a great sponsor for us because they are webcasting this debate, which is why you'll see so many different cameras around in so many different angles. So there are schools all over the country that instead of sitting here with us, are sitting in cafeterias and classrooms and watching the debate, and they'll be discussing the debate just like you will afterwards. So from Mexico City to North Carolina to Kansas, schools from all across the country will be watching live just like you're watching. And then the webcast is actually going to be archived, and people will be watching it later. So we thank 7 Star Academy for that. Just a couple quick announcements before we dive into what we're doing here. First of all, if you have a cell phone on, it would be a great time to turn it off, or at least turn it down. That would be fabulous. Please don't get up and walk around or fidget. Be nice just to sit through here. We're not going to do a lot of applause during the debate until after. So when somebody says something that you think is great, wait for the person on the opposing side to say something that tears it down, and vice versa. So if you see something or hear something that you don't like, don't worry, the other person will respond to that. This isn't your debate. This is an opportunity for you to listen and to think within your own mind, what would I say and how would I respond to that? But we have 2 excellent people to take care of that for us today. So we'll be here. The debate will be back and forth. There will be a time for question and answers. You are given a card. If you don't have your card yet, those cards will be passed out to you. And if you have a question after the opening statements, you'll be able to write down the questions, and then when they go to their back and forth, we'll be collecting the cards after their opening statements are done. Those cards will be reviewed, make sure we get a balanced representation from the audience, some questions for both individuals, and then when we do the question and answers from the audience, I'll be reading the questions myself from the podium here, or from up front here. So if you have a question during the debate that you want one of these gentlemen to answer, make sure you write it down on that card and turn it in when it's appropriate time. Let me go ahead and open this up in a quick word of prayer here, and then we'll introduce the 2 gentlemen that we brought in for the debate. Lord, we thank you so much for today. We thank you for the beautiful weather that we're having. We thank you for each of the individuals that are here. Father, thank you especially for Dan Barker and Dinesh D'Souza for coming and spending their time. Father, for presenting evidence, Father, that we can consider, that we can reason about, Father, that we can take home and think about, and Father, that we can draw close to you in our pursuit of you. Father, our desire is that we would desire to know the truth. And Father, your word has said that the truth will set us free. So Lord, I pray that you'd open up our minds and our hearts, Father, to the truth that you have presented for us. And Father, I just pray that you'd give us a wonderful time today, Father, as we argue and reason together. In Jesus' name, amen. Now I got that from Isaiah chapter 1, where the Lord says, come, let us argue, come, let us reason together. Maybe a little bit unusual for you to be at a debate in a church where we're asking the question, does God exist? Is there a reason to believe in God? I think it's probably somewhat humorous for God to sit and listen, for us to argue as his creation whether he exists or not. But there's evidence on both sides. And to present the evidence, we brought 2 gentlemen that have debated before, so they know each other well and they know each other's arguments well. But this is new for us and something exciting for us to be a part of. Dan Barker, who I'll introduce first, has an interesting background because he's a former minister. At the age of 15, Dan Barker became a teenage evangelist. He received his degree in religion from Azusa Pacific University when he was ordained a minister by Standard Community Church, California in 1975. He served as an associate pastor at a Friends, a Quakers church, an Assembly of God, and an independent charismatic church. He was a Protestant ministry in Mexico for a total of 2 years. He maintained a touring musical ministry for 17 years and is an accomplished pianist, record producer, and arranger and songwriter. For many years, he wrote and produced the annual mini musical for Gospel Light Publications' Vacation Bible School curriculum, which I'm sure some of us has gone through. Following 5 years of reading, Dan gradually outgrew his religious beliefs. He says, if I'd limited myself to Christian authors only, I'd still be a Christian today. But he lost his faith in faith. He publicly announced his atheism in January 1984. And actually, shortly thereafter, was on the Oprah Winfrey Show to announce that to the rest of the world. So it was quite a coming out there. He is now the PR director, or was the PR director for the Freedom from Religious Foundation from 87 to 2004. And he was elected co-president of the founder with Annie Laurie Gaylor in 2004. He's a contributing editor of Free Thought Today, and is involved with the foundation's state church lawsuits. This is Dan Barker. Dinesh D'Souza is a young man at that time, that I heard speak back in the early 90s, shortly after he'd spent some time in the Reagan White House. He's considered one of the top young policymakers in the country. New York Times Magazine has named him one of America's most influential conservative thinkers. He's a former policy analyst in the Reagan White House, and he served in the American Enterprise Institute, and he served was a writer at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Dartmouth College in 1983. He's written a number of books and won a number of major awards. Some of the most popular books, and the reason that we brought him here today, What's So Popular or What's So Great About Christianity, and a book that he has just released in November and will be available for a book signing afterward, is Life After Death, The Evidence. He writes a daily blog on AOL and a weekly column for townhall.com, speaks at top universities, business groups, civics, and churches across the country. Please welcome Dinesh D'Souza. We are going to start with their opening arguments. And remember, after their opening arguments are done, if you'd like to have a question, please write it down, and we'll pick those up, pass them down to the end of your rows, so we don't have to grab them from each one of you, but pass them down, and we'll pick them up at the end of the rows and take them back. So, Dan Barker, I believe you're starting.
Thank you, Dan. No, I don't have horns. Atheists are people too. Millions of good Americans don't believe in a God, and we love our families. We vote in elections, contribute to charity, serve in the military. We're your neighbors. We're just like you, and we're a growing number of people who prefer reason and kindness over superstition and faith. And I want to thank Prestonwood Christian Academy for all of your hostility. For all of your hospitality. You've been very gracious, very good people, and it's been a real pleasure to meet you. As Dan told you, I was a born-again Christian. I was called to the ministry. I preached the gospel for 19 years, mission work, evangelism, Christian songwriter. I'm still getting royalties from those Christian musicals, which is kind of fun. And I was a true believer. I really did believe it. I prayed, I talked with Jesus, I got goosebumps, I felt this father figure, I was born again, I read the Bible, I believed it was the inerrant word of God. All of that was so wonderful and moving to me. And if I was not a true Christian, nobody is. I truly believed it and lived it. And doesn't the Bible say, you shall know them by their fruits? You don't judge yourself whether somebody's a true Christian or not. You know them by their fruits. But I changed my mind, and I'm not going to tell you that whole story, but I eventually learned after 4 or 5 years of a gradual migration that there is no evidence for a God. Zero. In fact, Dinesh agrees with me. During our debate in Harvard last year, Dinesh said, I am an agnostic too. We don't know if there's a God, Dinesh said. I admit it. Dinesh is kind of like another Catholic, Blaise Pascal, the mathematician philosopher, who said the same thing. He was an agnostic. He said, we can't know, we don't know, but you're better off believing. And so Dinesh says he thinks, because most people on the planet are believers, he says, what's wrong with belief? Pascal and Dinesh are what you might call theistic agnostics, and that's a very honest position, by the way. I admire that and respect that, because he's not pretending more than he can support. I am what you would call an atheistic agnostic. Atheism is simply the absence of theism. I'm also an atheist because there's no good argument for a God. Bertrand Russell looked at all the arguments, especially the ontological argument and the teleological and the cosmological and all that, and we do debates about these things all the time. And Bertrand Russell basically concluded, these are all boiled down to bad grammar is all it is. None of those arguments work, and we'll talk about a little of them later. I'm also an atheist because there's no coherent definition of a God. How can you debate if something exists if you can't even define what it is? There is no agreement among believers as to the nature of this God or the moral principles of this God. Every one of them can open the Bible and show you, here's what we believe. This church here believes that Jesus was the eternal Son of God. And did you know that John Calvin, a Protestant reformer, had one of his close friends, Michael Servetus, burned at the stake, a co-reformer, because Michael Servetus said, no, Jesus is not the eternal Son of God. Jesus is the Son of the eternal God. He was killed for that. Protestants killing Protestants for heresy and for blasphemy. Catholics killing other Catholics. Catholics killing Protestants because they didn't have the truth. I'm also an atheist because there are no good replies to the arguments against a God. For example, the problem of evil. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there is no God. Those parents are desperately praying for their children. They don't fare any better than blind chance. Many of them pray, and those kids die horrible deaths. And the ones that do survive, is no difference from those who weren't prayed for. Prayer is a failure. Prayer might make you feel better. Prayer might help lower your blood pressure. But as organic healing, prayer is a failure. And finally, I'm an atheist because there's no need for a God. Millions of good people live moral lives, happy, loving, meaningful, purposeful lives without the belief in a God. And some of them are here in this audience. I know some of you came to sit in on this debate. Christianity has got it all wrong. Christianity is not true. The truth claims of Christianity are simply not supportable. I used to preach that the Bible was reliable. The Bible was our guidebook. The Bible was our absolute truth. But when you look at the Bible carefully, as an outsider would, and you look at the internal contradictions, the historical anachronisms, you look at the scientific inaccuracies in there, you look at some of the horrible examples of morality that are in that book, we have to conclude the Bible is not a basis for truth. There's a better way. Christianity has it all upside down. We are not treasure in earthen vessels. The earthen vessel is the treasure. We are biological organisms. We are animals. We evolved as animals. Now, Dinesh has written a really good book. What's so great about Christianity? For me, it's a mixed bag, obviously, and there are some howling mistakes in here, but there are some beautiful, eloquent passages that he has written that I really admire. For example, his passionate defense of the truth of evolution, I think is incredible. In a few pages, he succinctly tells us why evolution is true. He quotes the Pope admiringly, who says that evolution is more than a hypothesis. He says, evolution remains the best and most persuasive account of our origins. It is impossible to deny the theory's explanatory power. And you're also very charitable, I notice in there, because while you disagree with Richard Dawkins on the God question, you seem to admire Dawkins when he stays within biology, when he talks about the selfish gene and evolution and how we came. And you do point out correctly that many or most Christians find no conflict at all between evolution and their faith. However, in making the case that there had to be a first cause, Dinesh, in his book, refers to the singularity, that there was a beginning of the universe, one of these cosmological arguments. And he quotes Stephen Hawking in here saying, there was, in fact, a singular, there must have been a Big Bang singularity. Dinesh quotes Stephen Hawking in The Brief History of Time. There must have been a Big Bang singularity. And based on that claim that scientists made that there was a singularity, which means it was infinitely small space with an infinite amount of density. Dinesh goes on to say, well, then there was a beginning of time and a beginning of the universe, and therefore there must be something transcendent to the universe. You've all heard this argument before. But the point I want to make is that Dinesh completely misquotes Stephen Hawking. If you would just read the passage that you were quoting from, you said that Hawking said there must have been a Big Bang singularity. Here is what the paragraph actually says in that book. Hawking says, the final result was a joint paper by Penrose and myself in 1970, which at last proved that there must have been a Big Bang singularity, as you quote, provided only that general relativity is correct and the universe contains as much matter as we observe. He goes on to say, Hawking says, in the end, our work became generally accepted. In fact, I used to believe that too. I used to say that same thing. And nowadays, nearly everyone assumes that the universe started with a Big Bang singularity. It's perhaps ironic that having changed my mind, I am now trying to convince other physicists that there was, in fact, no singularity at the beginning of the universe, as we shall see later. It can disappear once quantum effects are taken into account. So the very paragraph that you're quoting to support your position actually says the exact opposite of what you intend your readers to believe. I think Dinesh is a good guy. I like him, and I don't think he's deliberately lying. I think he was just sloppy. He didn't read it right in the context, and that happens to all of us. It's happened to me. We're all human beings. Later in Dinesh's, in fact, I'm indebted to Victor Stenger for bringing this out. He's researched a lot of the attacks on the new atheism. Victor Stenger's book is called The New Atheism, and he also exposes other howling mistakes that people like D'Souza have made in their attempts to try to substantiate God and Christianity. But also, Dinesh talks about causality and says even David Hume knew there was no such thing as an uncaused cause. Well, of course David Hume thought that because he didn't know about quantum mechanics. Dinesh needs to be working back in the 1970s with his idea of what cosmology is like I used to think, but we have learned a lot since then. And now when you take quantum mechanics into effect, we realize that there in fact are uncaused causes in the universe. I won't dwell too much more on the book. I admire a lot of this, but he also misquotes Scripture. Galatians 3:28, he quotes it totally out of context, claiming that Christianity brings equality. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. And yet that applies only to baptized Christians. And Paul in Galatians goes on to say specifically that Arabs are excluded from this equality. Arabs are the son of the bondwoman and must be cast out. So the arguments for the existence of a God are spurious if you scratch beneath the surface. And besides, if there really were evidence for a God, think about this. If there really were evidence for a God, by now someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. Any scientist in the world would love to jump at that. And Dinesh isn't fighting that fight. In fact, Dinesh doesn't really debate the traditional apologetic evidentiary types of arguments. Dinesh basically is taking a different approach to the usefulness of Christianity and the commonality of belief among, so many people believe there must be something to it, right? But of course, belief is going down in the world. In the United States, non-belief is the fastest growing belief in the country right now. Did you know that? College students to 20-something age are the least religious they've ever been. 25 to 30% of that generation are finally getting rid of the shackles of religion. I think people like Dinesh, as sincere as he is and as smart as he is and as kind as he is, I think their approach is not so much to argue for the faith, but to attack the other side. Much of Dinesh's writings is really just an attack on atheists. He claims, for example, and I agree, Joseph Stalin was a horrible atheist, a horrible embarrassment. But Adolf Hitler was a horrible Christian. When I was a Christian, I never would have thought Hitler represented Christianity. I would have said, well, Hitler was not a true Christian, therefore we can't count him. And yet, he was a member of the church. He credited Jesus as his inspiration for exterminating the Jews. They had God is with us, Gott mit uns, on the Nazis' belt buckles. Hitler was not an atheist or a Hindu or whatever. He was a member of the church. a horrible example of what a Christian should be. But then, if you can excuse Hitler by saying he wasn't a true Christian, well, why couldn't I excuse Stalin by saying, well, Stalin wasn't a true atheist, right? What a silly argument. Obviously, Stalin was not a true humanist. Atheism is simply the lack of a belief in God. Atheism is not a moral philosophy. Atheism doesn't pretend to make you a better person. Christianity does, and yet when you compare the lives of Christians and atheists, you don't see any difference. Even George Barna, in his writings, admits we Christians are failing. There is no difference. Christian young people, even the young people in this church, are having sex just as often as non-Christian young people. They're the same species, the same people, even in spite of this abstinence thing, in spite of my and your parental admonition to these young people out here about waiting for marriage, it's about the same rate. Non-Christians, atheists, and Christians and born again, if you take it, you look at it, the divorce rate among Christians, born-again Christians, is actually higher than the divorce rate among non-Christians. And George Barna, who's an evangelical Christian, goes to great lengths to prove these things, chastising the church for failing. The difference between the Christian young people who are having unwise premarital sex, and I think it is unwise, is that they are not using protection. Christian young people are at a much higher risk of disease and of pregnancy than those who are at least informed enough to know if I'm going to do this, I should at least have some kind of protection. There's one of the dangers of Christianity, denying what is obvious about our natural human nature. So Christianity is not true, it is not reasonable, it is not a good moral guide. I think, however, most Christians are good people. I have a lot of good Christian friends. They are good people, but that's not because of Christianity. The goodness that Christianity and Islam and Judaism and all these other religions have in common is because it's a humanistic thing. We all know what kindness and goodness is. We all want peace. We all want less violence. We all want a world with more understanding, more acceptance, and more love. We all want those same things. Those are not Christian values. Those are human values. I think I can applaud most of you Christians for living truly good lives because you know what it means to be a true humanist, and you're smarter than Jesus was. You are kinder than the God of the Bible. You are good in spite of Christianity, and I applaud you for that. And I consider that we are all members of the same human species.
I want to say what a great privilege it is to be here. I have crossed swords with Dan a couple of times. As you probably figured by now, he was a devout Christian, then he had a bad accident, fell on his head, and that's why he's been saying the stuff he's been saying ever since. Look, boy, Dan, I'm tempted to jump right into my rebuttal. Dan has raised so many points, I feel a bit like the mosquito at the nudist colony. I'm just not sure where to begin. But I think I'm going to begin. I want to begin by changing my approach here. I was going to talk broadly about Christianity and its role in the world. But I want to address head up front this question of whether or not there is evidence for God, evidence for Christianity. I've done a few debates, and in talking about God, sometimes what I say is that we can't know, and by here I mean on the basis of reason, we can't know if there is an afterlife. We can't know if there is a God. Why? Because we don't see him. It's not as if God has stamped his name on the moon. It's not as if we have been able to go to the other side of the curtain or interview dead guys to find out if there's life after death. We can't know in that sense. In that way, that's why we are called believers. There's a big difference between belief and knowledge. I would say that I believe in Papua New Guinea. I believe it's over there. I haven't been, but I believe in it. I wouldn't say I believe in my brother, because I know the guy. So there's a key distinction here between belief and knowledge. And I think we should be honest about that. On the other hand, I do think that there is powerful evidence, both for God and specifically for Christianity, and I'm going to focus my opening remarks on some of that evidence. First of all, here we are flung into the world, and we have to ask some questions about it. The first one is, how did we get a world? How did we get a universe? Now, for a couple of centuries, there was a kind of scientific answer to this question that seemed to support atheism. Namely, the universe has always existed. There's always been a universe. There's no reason to ask how we got it. It's always been there. The universe is forever. Now, one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century is that this notion that the universe is forever is factually false. The universe is not forever. The universe had a beginning. In physics, it's called the Big Bang. In a sense, first there was nothing, and then there was a universe. Now, if you think about this for a moment, this idea that first there was nothing and then there was a universe actually was stated before the scientists figured it out. The writers of the first book of Genesis, a bunch of Hebrews, or Jews, they said first there was nothing and then there was a universe. And interestingly, these ancient Hebrews, if you ask them, well, did you do any scientific experiments to figure it out? They would say, no, we didn't do any experiments. God told us. This is how it happened. And you might say, well, yeah, but this is common to every other religion. They say the same thing, but actually, no. In most other religions in the world, the idea is that a god, or sometimes gods, fashioned the universe from some other existing stuff. Gods took some clay, or they took some pre-existing material, and like carpenters or architects, they built the universe. But the Jews were the first to say, in effect, no, the universe was made, as the Greeks said, ex nihilo, out of nothing. And what I'm saying is that today, modern science has discovered that that is basically true. Now, not only did the universe have a beginning, but very interestingly, space and time also had a beginning. By the way, this is important because space and time, scientists used to believe that space and time are eternal, which actually makes a certain kind of common sense. If somebody says, what happened a million years ago? Well, there was 1,000,001 years ago before that. Any time that you can posit in the past, there was the day before, the year before that. So time appears to stretch indefinitely, and space also. If Dan Panetti were to tell you, well, you know, space, it kind of comes to an end at that wall, you would say, well, but what's on the other side of that wall? More space. So space and time appear infinite. But modern science tells us no. Space and time are properties of our universe, which means that beyond our universe, no space, no time. Christianity has for many centuries maintained this idea of eternity, which is the idea of a God who exists outside of space and time. And what I'm saying is that this idea, which seemed a little bit crazy, very difficult to explain 100 years ago, now makes complete sense within modern physics. So my question to Dan Barker is this: if God didn't make the universe, who did? How did we get a universe? First there was nothing, and then there's a universe. If God doesn't explain it, why don't you do? Why don't you give us the explanation? Dan Barker cited Stephen Hawking in a rather convoluted quote that, far from undermining what I said, actually supported it. Stephen Hawking is the guy who did equations to show that, yes, the universe has a beginning. And then Stephen Hawking said, when I proved this, I became alarmed because I realized the theistic implications. In other words, nothing can come out of nothing. If there was nothing and then there was a universe, this seems to give support to the idea of a creator. So Hawking said, I'm very uncomfortable with that. I have to try now to figure out a way how this could have happened without God. And Hawking advances a theory which revolves on quantum fluctuations. Now, here's what Hawking says. He says maybe the universe came into existence in what he calls, quote, imaginary time. Is there such a thing as imaginary time? No. Where does the idea of imaginary time exist? Pretty much in Stephen Hawking's imagination. If you ask Stephen Hawking, do you have one shred of empirical evidence for your theory? He says, I have to confess, I don't. I've essentially made it up to get around the idea of God. And Hawking admits, my fellow physicists don't agree with me. They kind of laugh this as ridiculous. But Hawking says, but that's my theory. All right. But we are relying here on Stephen Hawking's reputation as a scientist, not on his atheist imagination. Now, I've spoken for a moment about the universe having a beginning. I think that points to a creator. Let me give you a second argument, which is sometimes called the fine-tuning argument. And the idea here is that our universe operates according to some very specific numerical values. If I take this pen and drop it, it will accelerate to the ground at a known speed. That's the speed of gravity. That's the force of gravity pulling the pen, if you will, to the ground. If a light beam flashes by us, it travels at a known speed. In science, that's called c, 186,000 miles a second in a vacuum. So the universe has multiple values. The electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, something called the weak force. And one physicist, Lee Smolin, who teaches at Princeton, he says it's sort of like this. It's like God is sitting at a big desk, and he's got 100 different dials, each representing one numerical constant, very precisely set to a fixed number. And then Lee Smolin says, but what if we scientists sneak into the room, and when God isn't looking, we fool with the dials? We change it. What if light were not to travel at 186,000 miles a second? What if it was 200,000 miles a second? What if the values of the universe were a little different? And then, this question, by the way, is studied by Stephen Hawking, and he describes it in his book, A Brief History of Time. He says basically that if you come in and you touch one of the dials, in this case, the rate of expansion of the universe, and you move it, he says, not 10%, not 1%, but 1 part in 100,000 millionth million, you would have no universe, you would have no life. In other words, the numerical values of our world have to be precisely what they are, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be here. The constants of the universe have to be fine-tuned in such a way that if they were any different, essentially there would be no existence. We certainly wouldn't be having this conversation. The universe is, you may say, a conspiracy to produce, well, us. Now, this argument, which is the fine-tuned universe, has put modern atheism completely on the defensive. Again, I would invite Dan Barker, if we don't have a fine-tuner that tuned the universe in this way, how did it get to be this way, I ask. Now, remember, this is an argument completely immune from Darwinian attack. We're not talking about whether the dog and the wolf had a common ancestor. We're not talking about whether life form A became life form B. That's irrelevant. We're talking about why the entire universe is the way it is. Not just our planet Earth, but the entire universe. I would say that the fine-tuning of the universe is a strong indication that there is a creator or a designer, and moreover, one that cares about life. Why? Because the universe is fine-tuned for life. If it were tuned differently, there would be no life in it. I've spoken a little bit about God. And I want to speak a little more specifically about Christianity. And I want, in some senses, to zoom right in and talk about the central event that defines Christianity, namely the resurrection. I've just written a book on life after death. Christianity is unique in all the religions of the world in saying that life after death is not just coming sometime, it's already happened. There's a guy, Christ, he died, he came back. And I want to look for a moment at the resurrection as a historical event. I want to ask, is there actually some evidence for the resurrection? And I want to begin with a few facts that historians agree on. Mainstream historians generally concede that these facts occurred. Now we're going to try to make sense of these facts. So what are the facts? Fact number one, there was a guy named Jesus. He walked on the earth. He preached. He made some enemies. They got a hold of him. They crucified him. Fact number one. Fact number two, a group of Jesus' disciples, after his crucifixion and death, came to the tomb in which Jesus was buried, a tomb with a big stone on it and Roman guards guarding it. And they said, when we got to the tomb, we found the tomb empty. I'm not saying the tomb is empty. I'm saying the disciples claimed to find the tomb empty. Third, numerous groups of disciples on different occasions said, we saw the risen Christ. We saw Christ after his death. He came to us. He spoke to us. He showed us his wounds. And we believe we have seen Christ again. That's claim number 3. The disciples claim on numerous occasions to have seen the risen Christ. And 4, the disciples were so excited by this and so animated that they began a movement of conversion. Even in the face of horrible persecution and opposition, people said to them, renounce Jesus or be killed. Many of them went to their deaths. So now these are the 4 facts that need to be explained. How are they explained? The Jews, for the first couple of centuries after the death of Christ, said the disciples stole the body. That's why all this happened. The disciples stole the body and then claimed that Jesus was resurrected. But think about it. Disciples, mainly women, somehow fought off the Roman guards, rolled back the stones, stole the body? It's a little far-fetched. How would they have done that? And if they stole the body, they would have known Jesus was actually dead. And yet, why would they go to their deaths in the face of persecution and say, no, he's alive? Who would give their life for a lie, for what they know to be a lie? So modern theorists reject that. They don't say, they dismiss this idea that the disciples stole the body. They say that's crazy. But the main atheist explanation today is the disciples were having hallucinations. They didn't really see Christ. They weren't lying, because no one goes to their death for a lie. But it was sort of like you think you saw Elvis, or you think you saw UFOs. But the problem with these hallucinations, for the most part, is that hallucinations are typically private. It's like a dream. Typically, hallucinations aren't shared. You don't have hundreds of people who have exactly the same hallucination. Frankly, if a bunch of people say, oh, we were in Vegas, we saw Elvis, are they lying? Are they having a hallucination? No, they probably saw one of the Elvis impersonators that's playing one of the casinos in Vegas. Or people who say, I saw a UFO. It's not that you're lying, you're not having a hallucination. You probably saw a meteor or a comet. It probably wasn't aliens, but you didn't make it up. These disciples knew Christ. They claimed to have seen him, and they were willing to go to their deaths for what they saw. What's the best explanation for that? Now imagine if the resurrection occurred, that's a fantastic explanation. That would explain why the tomb is empty. That would explain how Jesus came and appeared to them. He really did. And it would explain why in the face of persecution they were able to do what they did. So here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that even when we set aside faith and look at history, there is evidence for God. There is evidence for Christianity. Thank you very much.
Dan, you have 5 minutes for the rebuttal.
Thank you, Dinesh. The first 2 arguments that Dinesh gave are not evidence. Did you see what he's doing? He's making a flip here. What he gave us was a gap, a problem that we have, a certain unknowable thing that how could it have been? And then he plugs the gap with his God, whatever his God is like. This is known as the God of the gaps. Even though in your book you say you decry that argument, and yet you use that very thing yourself. The ancients used to hear the thunder and see the lightning, and they wondered, what is it? It's a being, an animal, a person, a god up there named Zeus or Thor. And they thought that's what was causing. They didn't know what it was. Now we understand electricity and weather. That gap is closed, and that's what drives science. What day of the week is it today? Thor's Day. We have a day of the week devoted to the belief in this God who no longer exists. That gap is closed. It's gone, right? And sure, there are gaps in our current understanding, but that's what drives science. It's wonderful to find these questions, but to just irresponsibly plug it with your God. No cosmologists, and you're way behind the times here, Dinesh, no cosmologist says, first there was nothing. None of them say that. There was no singularity. The Big Bang is the origin of our current universe that we live in. You say that space-time had a beginning, but that's not what cosmologists are saying anymore. That's passé. That's ancient history in cosmology. Even Lee Smolin, has come up with a number of his multiverse ideas that even universes themselves go through an evolutionary sort of natural selection. It's a hypothesis, it's a gap, I admit, but scientists say let's keep the gap open rather than just, because of our religious faith, plug it with our ideas. And you're misconstruing what Hawking meant by imaginary time. He's using the word imaginary time in the same way that mathematicians use the phrase imaginary numbers. They're very useful. Hawking was not saying that there's an imaginary time outside of time. What he's saying is that we could conceive of time in two dimensions. Since our brains don't intuitively understand what it could be like to have more than one dimension of time, he says, let's call that imaginary time. And he actually worked out a mathematical model within our universe, not outside of our universe in the brief history of time. So that cosmology that you are presenting to us really is not representing. You're attacking a straw man. Scientists are not saying that thing. The fine-tuning argument, that's a good argument, by the way. But again, it's a God of the gaps. How did all these knobs get turned exactly? Suppose you were in prison and you're going to be executed. Suppose someone tells you, Dinesh, we're going to tie you to a stake and blindfold you, and there are 100 expert riflemen who are going to, at the same time, pull the trigger. They have never missed. You hear the count. Ready, aim, fire, and you hear this loud explosion, but you're still alive. How did that happen? Did they all just miss? What are the odds that you're still alive? What are the infinitesimal odds that maybe that was a conspiracy, maybe they really liked you and they missed on purpose, or maybe their guns all jammed, what? That calls for an explanation. The fine-tuning of the constants of our universe do call for an explanation. Why are we here? Why is life here when it seems like it shouldn't be? Then you take off your blindfold and you realize that there were 101 prisoners. One of them had to survive. According to many of the multiverse theories, our current Big Bang that we live within right now is just one. In fact, there's a Planck constant which makes the singularity impossible. Quantum fluctuations, in fact, show that nothing comes from nothing. In fact, in outer space right now, complete empty void of outer space, no matter at all, there's quantum uncertainty and wave uncertainty there, and matter and antimatter is constantly being churned and destroyed. Occasionally, like Hawking says, at the horizon of a black hole, one of those escapes, and actually matter is created from nothing at all, from what they call wave probabilities of quantum mechanics. I wrote a whole chapter in my book, which you have, on the resurrection of Jesus. And the arguments you gave are not good historical arguments. We don't know that there were 500 people who saw Jesus. Paul told us in 1 Corinthians that there were 500 people, but he told it to people 25 years later, 1,500 miles away. There was no way anybody was going to verify or confirm these reports. The reports of the resurrection are internally contradictory. There are many other plausible explanations for the origin of the myth. I wish we had time to do a debate on the resurrection of Jesus, but in history, Jesus did not rise from the dead. That is a story. That is an anecdote. That is a religiously motivated idea. Historians say that the Bible is not a reliable source for truth. Therefore, the resurrection is not evidence for a God.